I want to let everybody know, first of all, that we are so happy to be part of this webinar and part of this campaign, Schools and Communities First. Actually, Cal Nonprofits is officially an endorser and a sponsor of the initiative. Our staff has gathered signatures for it. And so like most nonprofits, I think we have a big stake in this issue, not just for our communities, but for our organizations. And I'm especially happy today that we have two like not just speakers, but like superstar speakers. I'm hoping everybody is thinking like, okay, like this is so cool. We are actually getting like the top people in this whole movement. Michele Prichard, one of the founding members of Liberty Hill and a leader in every important cause I think that there's been in Los Angeles and recently, and Veronica Carrizales with California Calls. Both of them are really in the leadership of this initiative and kind of legends in their own right. So I think we're very fortunate to have them in particular talking with us. And this is important to us because one of the reasons is because it's a tax measure. And I think when we nonprofits think about money and government, we tend to focus on the budget. And that is really important, that the state budget and the federal budget have the money in it for nonprofit delivered services. But one of the important things about tax policy is it lasts a long time, whereas the budget is a year old and you have to start over again. So I think we're very happy to be involved, not in this issue because it's a tax issue and just of terrific importance. So my job here to some degree is going to be to interrupt Michele and Veronica with various kinds of questions that people ask, or if they slide out of the screen to yank them back on. Towards the end of the session, we'll do more, there'll be more discussion about, for example, what exactly nonprofits can and should be doing about this issue. And also, a little bit more about the campaign strategy and how it's going. But most of what we're going to talk about is the content itself, because that's actually, of course, the really important part. Okay, so take it away, Veronica.
Great, wonderful. Good morning, everyone. That's us. That's another another photo of us. Okay, so now let's talk about creating a new legacy for California's future. So Schools and Communities First is a constitutional amendment. It's an initiative that will be on the 2020 November ballot. Just wanted to review with you some of the campaign goals. What we're trying to do is we're trying to reclaim $12 billion every year for our local schools and communities. We want to win a long-term fix to our broken tax system, and we want to create stable revenue for the state of California. For us, this is also about making history, right? We want to create a new legacy of investing in our future instead of starving schools and communities of needed resources. So when you think about California, California is a state of deep contradictions, right? On the one hand, we have incredible wealth. We have the 5th largest economy in the world. 26% of the billionaires in the US live here. 144 billionaires with a combined fortune of $9.1 trillion. And CEOs make on average about 361 times more than their workers. So we have a lot of wealth, but at the other side of it, we also have extreme wealth inequality. We have one of the nation's highest poverty rates when adjusted for the cost of living behind Washington, D.C., with 1 in 5 children living in poverty. California is ranked 39th in per pupil spending behind Texas and Oklahoma. And California has one of the largest and most expensive prison systems in the entire world and spends more on prisons than it does on education. As I mentioned before, California ranks 39th in per pupil spending, but we rank actually at the bottom. We rank 50th in K through 12 students per teacher, per librarian, and per guidance counselors. And so that's huge. And when we look at the funding for education, we can see that there's been a steady decline in funding education since 1978 when Proposition 13 passed. It drained our schools of critical dollars needed to continue to provide a top-tier education for all of California students. California fell from 7th in the nation in per pupil spending to where we're currently at now. And then just to provide a comparison, California spends about $10,259 per student compared to the US average of about $12,756 per student, and New York spends almost double, right, than California, and that's what we're seeing in the bar chart here. You know, the other thing to note when we saw a decline in funding for education, we also saw a decline in funding for local governments, so for counties, cities, and special districts. According to this chart, which was put together by the Legislative Analyst Office, between 1977 and 2014, there was a 150 decrease in revenue per capita or per person in spending around local services. We know that local governments fund important services that promote well-being and access for many folks. These services include a broad range, but just to name a few: local parks, public libraries, hospitals. And so while we've seen a decrease in these services at the local level, we also see that local governments have been starved for revenue. And as a consequence of this, in November 2018, we had over 400 local ballot measures at the city level and at the county level for sales taxes, parcel taxes, you name the gamut, right? And this was in an effort to raise critical funds for the homeless, for parks, for transit, and for schools. And so we see not only a decline in revenue, but we also see a shift of the burden, right, onto everyday people.
So how did we get here? And Veronica already alluded to this briefly, but we really think that much of the decline and disinvestment of the last 40 some odd years can really be traced back to the passage of Prop 13 in 1978 in California. So what did it do? It established a 1% property tax rate on all properties based on their value at the time of sale or when there was a change in ownership on the property. And, you know, it was largely motivated by concern for homeowners who were facing, you know, skyrocketing property taxes at that time, but it ended up including all commercial and industrial properties as well, including some of the largest, you know, multinationals in the whole world. So our first slide here is, you know, one of the main beneficiaries in California actually is the our oil companies. Who have owned land since the 1970s, the 1980s, you know, large parcels, and they are paying taxes based on very out-of-date land values. So for example, you've got Shell Oil Corporation, which is the 5th largest company in the world. They've got a big refinery complex in Carson here in Los Angeles County, and we've done calculations on that show if they were paying at the same rate as other industrial land in that area, they would be paying $4 million more per year to benefit Los Angeles' schools and local services. And you've got Exxon, 11th largest corporation, Chevron, another big one at 33rd, all getting a massive tax loophole benefit. And just really quickly, some other, you know, other kinds of companies, you know, Walmart owns hundreds of stores in California, and again, paying on outdated land values. By revenue, they are the largest corporation in the world. McDonald's with thousands of properties, which they bought a long time ago, but they lease them out to franchise owners who pay at market rate. So basically, they're pocketing the difference in terms of their property tax. And then we show here Blackstone, which is the world's largest private equity real estate company, which owns major hotel chains. Again, they charge market prices for the rooms, depending upon the type of hotel, but they are paying very low in property tax. We thought we'd just give a few kind of local examples, and I was glad to hear some of the folks early on who signed up for the call today. So here in downtown San Francisco on Union Square, we have the Grand Hyatt Hotel, which is actually paying on land value at about $1,562 per square foot. And right across the way is the Handlery Union Square Hotel, which is paying at a much different rate of $161 per square foot. So just taking this one example, example, if the handlery were to pay even at the same rate as the Grand Hyatt, this would generate about $350,000 more per year in San Francisco for schools and for services. And again, the point is these hotels are charging very, very similar room rates per night.
You know, if I could add one thing,
Yeah,
that
sure.
in Silicon Valley, this is particularly noticeable because the old companies like Intel and National Semiconductor, you know, are paying such lower rates than the newer companies like Apple and LinkedIn and Google because they purchased their properties. And so there's just this ridiculous inequality between what different companies are paying.
Yes, thank you, Jan. Well said. So here in Los Angeles, one of the bad actors, no pun intended, are the movie studios. Again, longtime landowners in the area, of course. You know, we've got an example here of the Disney campus, which is in Burbank with 43 acres. The last time the property was reassessed was 1975. So they are still paying at $5 a square foot. And actually just right down the street, the Burbank NBC studios, which were assessed in 2008, so even that's 12 years ago, we're paying $180 per square foot. So again, if you multiply this difference, it comes out to $3.5 million more that Disney should, you know, again, one of the largest companies in the world, should be paying to benefit Los Angeles schools and services. And I know we have somebody here from Santa Barbara on the call, so that's great. We included this example of the Hilton Santa Barbara Beachfront Resort, a beautiful property, but they are paying a factor of 12 less on their land value at a little over $12 a square foot, which is based on 1997 land values. And then just around the corner is a, you know, much lower quality Motel 6, which is paying $164 a square foot. So again, multiplying that difference, we would be seeing a $1.5 million per year contribution to the tax base from the Hilton hotels if they were paying at the same rate. So just to summarize here, the point is, you know, this corporate loophole has resulted in very wide disparities, as Jan underscored, benefiting longtime, you know, wealthy landowners and many multinationals, and it has done so at the expense of schools and services. I know we have someone here from Kern County, and we have examples also from Central Valley. While the land values may not be as expensive as some of these coastal communities that we've highlighted, we have an example in Fresno, for instance. The Gap stores are just paying pennies on the square footage compared to similar retail operations in the area.
That's right.
So back over to Veronica.
Great. So what's our solution? So our solution is to close the commercial property tax loophole that Michele was talking about, and we're going to do that by reassessing commercial industrial properties at fair market value. By doing this, we would reclaim $12 billion annually for schools and for communities. Our measure continues with all the protections that have been put in place under Prop 13 for residential properties. So all residential properties will stay the same. We provide small incentives, small business tax incentives, which we'll talk about more in a moment. And then we ensure strict accountability and transparency, and we require public reporting annually on the use of funds. So who's impacted? When we look at, and actually USC, the Program for Environmental and Regional Equity just did some analysis on this for us. When we look at who's impacted in the state of California, it's commercial and industrial properties valued over $3 million. When we look at where the revenue is going to come, about almost 80% of the revenue comes from only 6% of commercial industrial properties in the state of California valued over $5 million, and Michele will talk more about that in a moment. Again, we're fully exempting residential property. We're also fully exempting agricultural lands. And so if your property, for those of you in the Central Valley, if it's currently zoned or used as agricultural lands, it will be exempt from reassessment. And this is because there's these long-term land grants called the Williamson's Act that allow you to, that prevent you from doing major increases on property taxes for agricultural property. And so our measure takes that step further by fully exempting agricultural land from the measure. And Jan, did you have a question?
Well, so this is such an important point that residential property, people's houses and farms will not be touched. But, the opposition is already saying that it will affect houses. How are you countering that argument?
Yeah, unfortunately, that what we have seen is that the opposition has been spreading lies about the measure and saying that it will impact residential property. We've been working with the local news outlets to provide education on the measure. So ABC News just did a segment on this where they did a fact check, and they showed that that was an untrue statement. The opposition has been sending mailers. They've been posting on Nextdoor. There's a false Facebook post that has been going around, just spreading lies. And so the news media has been helping. So ABC did a news segment. Politico also did a fact check. And so that's one way that we counter it, is by doing public education through the news, radio outlets. We've also been working with local stakeholders through our grassroots movement statewide to ensure that we're doing presentations on the issue and we're clarifying the facts about who's impacted and who's not impacted.
Thanks.
No problem. Okay, so where does the money go? So so the revenue from this measure goes to the way property taxes is currently allocated. So about 60% of the revenue will go to local communities, and that's spread between counties, cities, and special districts based on their current property tax allocations. And about 40% of the revenue will go to public education, and that's divided between K through 12. So 89% goes to K through 12 and 11% goes to community colleges. And that's again based on the current allocations for property taxes. One thing that I'm really excited to share is to talk about our education equity formula. And so on the education side, what we're doing is we're pulling the property tax revenue statewide into a statewide pool. And then it's being redistributed across the state of California based on the local control funding formula. And the reason we're doing that is because we want to ensure that the funding for education is going to schools with the greatest needs. And so, as you know, the local control funding formula provides concentrated grants of funding for schools with large populations of students that are on the free lunch program, which is an indicator of poverty, that are in the ESL program, which is English as a second language, or in the foster care program. And so this is intended to help those school districts that have higher populations of students with these needs to support them. The other important thing to note is because the money is pulled statewide into a special education fund, this revenue is considered new revenue on top of Proposition 98. And so that's a really key point because it's new revenue on top of 98, so it means that the state can't just use the new revenue on education to backfill the Proposition 98 guarantee.
I want to ask, we have a question on this one, which is, so does this mean that the state university system won't get any money from schools and communities first?
Yes, so that does mean that based on this measure, the UC and the CalState system do not get revenue from this measure because that's just the way property tax revenue is currently allocated. So we're not changing the current allocations for that.
But I would just maybe respond and say that while technically the dollars don't flow into the UC or CSU system, by expanding the resources for K-12 and community colleges, it helps relieve pressure on the state budget, which is where, which is how the UCs and CSUs are funded.
Thanks.
So, good question.
No problem. So what does this mean for schools and school funding? I think this is a first step, right, in restoring California schools to world-class schools. This would mean additional funding that could be used for libraries, for school nurses, for counselors, and for reducing class sizes. Recently in California, just last year, We saw major strikes, right, happening in the Bay Area and in Los Angeles, where teachers went on strike, not just about reducing class sizes, but it was about increasing the number of counselors, increasing the number of school nurses at the schools. I know at my kids' schools, their school nurse is not there every day of the week, and so that's a big problem for parents. And this is a step in the right direction for ensuring that funding is going to these very important needs that we have in the schools. What does it mean for communities? I mentioned earlier that the money is divided between counties, cities, and special districts. We know that counties and cities pay for very important services that we all rely on, public libraries, senior services, community health clinics, the roads, fixing potholes, fire and infrastructure, and then affordable housing and homeless services. And so these are all critical services that we all rely on, and this measure will provide important funding to continue to expand those services.
So Michele and Veronica, one of the questions is, what about the argument that this will end up funding police departments and maybe other things that people don't like?
So I know that issue has been raised, and we've heard it from many folks in South LA and other communities where we see where we've had incidents of police harassment, and there's concerns, right, around the police. And so I think it'll be important. I've always seen this as a two-step process, right? The first step is to get the revenue coming back to our local communities. The second step is to push at the local level to ensure that the revenue is going to the important services that we all care about and depend on, like mental health services, like fire services, emergency responder services. And so I do see this as a two-step process. Having the revenue at the local level allows us to push to ensure that that revenue is going to go to those critical services that we all depend on.
So one related questions come from one person. It says, I'm going to read it. My daughter will be entering middle school next year, and at all the public schools I visited, the facilities are atrocious. Bathrooms are routinely closed because they're broken. At one, the fire sprinkler system hadn't been tested for 3 years. A dead rat was discovered in an air bin. Will this measure ensure that some of the monies will go to facilities improvements, not just to reduce class size and school nurses and things you mentioned?
Well, I was going to say, ironically, this coming election, our primary election on March 3rd, will have a Prop 13 measure on the ballot, which is just coincidental that it happens to have the same number, but it's Prop 13, and it is a bond measure to raise $15 billion for school rehab. It's largely rehab versus new construction, because the problem that you just described is sadly common throughout many, many public schools. Again, just another kind of the visible face of what this disinvestment has meant. So, yeah.
And I guess just as a follow-up, funding for infrastructure for schools is usually paid for through bonds. And so this March will be an opportunity to address that issue that we're seeing in many schools, across the state with older infrastructure that need rebuilding or more construction.
Right. I mean, it should help with, school expenses, operation expense. So, maintenance of the facilities, but actual rehab and construction is, as Veronica said, is a capital expense. It's different than the funds from this measure. Yeah. All right, so just moving along. What will schools and communities first do for businesses? We like to argue that it's really going to help to level the playing field. As you saw in those previous examples, there's such a wide disparity in the taxes that are being paid by companies that are really doing the same kind of business, offering the same kind of service in the same part of town. Our research, so that's point number one. Secondly, the research that USC has conducted and they just released this report last week, shows that nearly 80%, technically 78% of the new revenue is going to come from just 6% of all commercial properties. And all of those are high-end properties that are valued at $5 million or more. So the point here is that it is really a small fraction of properties that will be paying the most. So it's, in that sense, it's a very targeted tax on really the wealthiest sector.
We have a question. We also have a question about this. Do you know how many people are employed right now by that 6% of property holders, commercial property holders?
You know, I can't answer that right offhand, and possibly we could figure that out. I don't know. Do you have a reply to that?
We don't. Now, so what the USC study looks at is that they look at parcels, and so they're looking at commercial, industrial, and vacant lands.
Nice.
So it's a mix of properties. So not all of that 6% are going to be properties that actually have employees, and so that'll be different to track.
And you don't have a number when you don't.
Trying to make one up. So how about impacts on small businesses? Well, again, you know, closing this kind of anti-competitive loophole where you've got, you know, 2 different gas stations across the corner and one is paying on such low value compared to the other. The second way is, we'd like to really emphasize this. This is not a change in the tax rate. The tax rate will remain at 1%. We are raising the base value of the property to fair market prices, fair market value. And that means that California will still, and California businesses will still be paying one of the lowest tax rates on property in the whole country. And then this last piece at the bottom of the screen about a large tax break, there's something called the business personal property tax. It's a tax that's businesses pay on equipment and fixtures. So if you're a restaurant, you pay it on your stove and your freezer. If you're an industrial plant, you pay it on your boilers and your lighting fixtures and so forth. If you're an office, it's a tax you pay on your computers and your photocopy machine if you own them. It's regarded as a nuisance tax by many small businesses. So we are going to exempt the first $500,000 in value for equipment and fixtures, which will be a big tax break for 90% of businesses in California that are small businesses. So we think that that's really significant. And we've already called out this point, but just to
small business. Sure. Again, we have a question from Bobby. So, you know, if McDonald's is right now pocketing the difference, right, on this, make sure I kind of understand this question too. So, you know, if taxes on McDonald's go up, aren't they just going to pass those along to the franchise owners? It's not going to actually affect McDonald's Corporation?
Well, you know, we like to say, and I think it's the truth, that prices are really set by the market. So there's a lot of complex factors that go into that. But if McDonald's raises its prices by that much, then I suppose people can go to, I don't know, In-N-Out Burger or, you know, a different, you know, Carl's Jr. I don't know. I don't usually frequent fast food places, but the idea is that, you know, those prices are really set by very big market forces. You know, same thing with regard to oil prices, honestly. It's really set by an international global market.
Well, so yeah, I guess the other thing to mention on that is that Dr. Chris Benner out of, is it UC Santa Cruz? Yes. UC Santa Cruz did some research on this and published a report where he talks about that very same issue, that prices for goods and services are set by the market, and so we have market rate prices. Currently, right now, you have businesses, as Michele showed in the earlier example, that are right across from each other. You have one that's paying property taxes at market value, and another business right across the way that is benefiting and essentially being subsidized. They're not providing a discount to us because they're paying a lower amount on their property taxes. They're pocketing those savings, and that's for that same reason, because the prices for goods and services are set by the market. So we're currently paying market value rates, right, for the goods and services that we purchase. And so that will more than likely not change, because that has already been set by the market.
Thanks, because we also have a question that's kind of related, that, you know,
Sure.
won't retail businesses just increase their prices? And would that end up, if they increase them so much that people can't buy them, that they'll end up closing? And this person comments that Gap has even closed some of their retail stores in Studio City in Hollywood. And so I think, but I appreciate your pointing out. I do think sort of in the nonprofit community, there's a little bit of a myth, oh, like, for, you know, small businesses can just raise their prices. And I think you're pointing out, you can't just double the price of your cupcakes, for example. People just won't buy them. So,
and then the other point I want to make is the point that Michele made earlier, based on the USC data that we got. So when we look at the $12 billion, right, in revenue per year, almost 80% of that is coming from only 6% of commercial industrial properties in the state of California. So what does that tell us? That tells us that the majority, right, of properties in California are already paying taxes based on market value. So it's really just a small percentage of commercial industrial properties in the state that will be impacted by this measure. So I think when we're thinking about, well, how is it going to impact us? It's not the vast majority of corporations in the state of California that have been benefiting from this and that will be impacted. It's only a small fraction. So I think when you think about the scale of impact on commercial industrial properties here, or on large corporations, then it gives you a better picture of what the impact will be on everyday people. And so that's why we like to emphasize that the impact on everyday people will essentially be the impact that we're going to see for schools, and the impact that we're going to see on improved services at the local level.
So just to move on and kind of complete, now we've already referenced this, what Schools and Communities First will do for residential property, but we want people to really listen up and take notes. As we said, it keeps tax protections for all residential properties. So of course that's homeowners, but it also means renters. It means people who live in mobile home parks. It means people who might be in nursing home facilities. Even though some of those are commercial operations, like, you know, an assisted living facility or a nursing home, as long as the property is used for a residential purpose, it will be exempt from reassessment. We're just leaving all that as it is now. And I say this because this, again, is how the opposition is going to try to defeat this measure and protect their, you know, their special interests, is by confusing the voters that it is going to take away and increase the cost of their own housing. Of course, this is Cal Nonprofit, so we just wanted to have one word about, you know, what we think this will mean for the nonprofit community that provides so much in the way of services to people in their areas. As you saw on a former slide, 60% of the revenues will go to cities and counties. And this is a really important point. Those are discretionary revenues, you know, unlike state grants and federal grants that are largely restricted in their purpose. These revenues can be determined by city councils and boards of supervisors as to how they will be spent. And as many of you on the call know, nonprofits, of course, provide much of their programs and services through, you know, foundation grants and individual donors and our fundraising events that we do, but many nonprofits also get contracts from cities and counties to provide critical services for senior citizens, for meal programs, for community health clinics, for youth and after school programs. And I especially want to underscore housing and homelessness services. You know, here in Los Angeles, the voters passed two big measures. One, a bond measure to build affordable homeless housing, and another at the county to provide homeless services. The construction money is already gone. It's already been allocated, you know, and here we are, we're not even 2 years after that yet. So these will be significant revenues for homeless services and many of the others that we mentioned there. Let me also say that it will enable local government to do a better job of expanded services. So important entities like departments of public health and mental health, or housing departments, or DPSS, Department of Social and Public Services, they will have additional resources to be able to have more caseworkers and the like. So final provision here, the accountability on the measure, we thought this was very important. Every entity, whether it's a school district, a city, or a county that receives funding from this measure will have to annually publish how it is spending it and make it available on their website in easy to understand terms. Veronica already mentioned at the state level, because by law, the education share will go up to the state. That new fund, which is over and above Prop 98, cannot be amended by the legislature. It has to, it's designated how it will be spent. Again, emphasizing local control over where the money goes, related to the question about police services or jails. You know, this will come back to your city council people and supervisors to determine how to spend. Yeah, Jan.
When you say local control, is it going to counties, or what does say more about what local control means?
Sure. So again, they're discretionary funds, and every city council, every board of supervisors votes annually to approve budgets on how funds will be spent in their counties. And again, you know, some of those funds come from federal sources, some from the state, some from fees and other kinds of mechanisms. But these property tax revenues are discretionary. They are general fund. They can be used as the decision makers vote to spend them. And so we come back to, you know, again, the community organizations on the phone who get activated around the budget every year. You will have an opportunity to influence the expenditure of the funds.
What I'm hearing you say is that these will be, because they'll be property taxes, they will go through the normal channels that property taxes go through. Is that right? Okay.
Exactly. Exactly. And the last point, of course, the funds are always subject to audit. Okay.
Great. So now let's talk about what our plan is to win. We talked, we've given you some good understanding of what the measure is, who will be impacted, what we think the benefits are to our schools and communities. And so now you're probably wondering, so how are they going to do this thing? How are they going to win? And so want to just cover a few points on this. So one of the first steps is to expand our coalition and build an undeniable movement. We currently have a statewide grassroots coalition of both labor, community, a broad range of groups that are behind this effort, and we want to expand the movement behind the effort even further. We also want to do large-scale public education on the issue. We've spent the beginning of the year doing a number of polling, and we'll continue to do polling and message testing and public education on the issue. We want to expand the electorate, and we want to raise the resources needed for the campaign. And we'll give a little bit more details on each of them in just a moment. So the first one is building a winning coalition. I mentioned earlier that we have a statewide coalition. It's called the Schools and Communities First Coalition. We have a table of core partners, and then we have a larger group of executive committee members. There's currently 26 organizations that are part of the coalition, and here on the left, you get to see a list of the different groups that are part of the coalition. So my organization, California Calls, SEIU California, ACLU, PICO California, the California Teachers Association, YIMBY California, the League of Women Voters, just to give you a sense of the broad array of organizations, right, that have been working on this issue and that are currently actively collecting signatures so that we can qualify the measure for the ballot. We also have over 520 endorsing organizations and individuals across the state. Including Cal Nonprofits, which has endorsed. Just last week, we announced that Senate Pro Tem Senator Atkins has endorsed our measure. So we're really excited to now have the two top leaders in the legislature. Anthony, Assembly Member or Speaker Rendon had previously endorsed, and now we have the endorsement from Atkins. So we have the two top leaders in the legislature who have endorsed. We also recently announced the endorsement from Tony Thurman, so we're really excited about that, who's our superintendent of schools in California. We have about 111 school board officials across the state that have endorsed, about almost 100 local elected officials that have endorsed. We have groups like the PTA, the California Alliance for Retired Americans. We have major foundations that have endorsed, like the San Francisco Foundation, the East Bay Community Foundation. And we also have gotten some big support from the tech industry, like the Chan Zuckerberg initiative, which is supporting the issue. And so we're excited. We're expanding endorsements from the small business community, and we're really excited to have support from the tech industry on this issue.
So we have quite a few questions on this strategy matter. So let me just ask a couple of them now. So, you know, does this going to require 2/3 to pass?
No, because it's a statewide measure, it only requires 50% plus one, right, to win on a statewide ballot initiative.
And a question from Ann is that I heard that there were competing initiatives to reverse Proposition 13 that will be on the ballot. Is there another one? And if so, what's the difference between them?
Well, this measure is not an attempt to reverse Proposition 13. What this measure is about is reforming the commercial industrial side of it. There's, from my understanding, there's no competing initiatives.
Nothing is qualified yet.
It's qualified, right?
No, I think the realtors are circulating something, right?
So if you can remember, in 2018 there was SCA. What was it? No, Prop 5 was it? Yes, Prop 5. Yes. Prop 5 was on the ballot, and that was put forward by the California Realtors Association, that actually failed at the ballot in 2018. They're making a second attempt, but that's not necessarily a competing initiative, but they are trying to place a measure on the ballot. Sure. Yeah. So the next point is around public education. So we want to strengthen the support around our measure through a large-scale public education campaign. When we look at what voters know about Proposition 13 and what they know about the issue, we know that 58% of voters know little or nothing about Prop 13, and 81% of voters who know about Prop 13 are confused about what it does. And so what does this say? This tells us that there's a generational gap as it relates to Prop 13. Things are going to get even further confusing in March when we have an initiative on the ballot called Prop 13, which has nothing to do with commercial property taxes or homeowner taxes, and has everything to do with school infrastructure bonds. And so things are going to get even more confusing. For this reason, we're not talking about the issue as Prop 13. We're not calling it Reform Prop 13. We're calling it Schools and Communities First, because we want to emphasize that the revenue will go to help our schools and communities. And this is an important point for people to understand, that there's just a lot of confusion on the issue of Prop 13, and it will continue to get confusing, right, after the March ballot. And so this is an opportunity for all of us to redefine the issue. So we're leading with Schools and Communities First. We have a great title and summary, and what we have seen is when we lead with where the revenue will go, we increase our chances of winning with our new title and summary, and with leading with where the revenue will go. We're actually now polling at 58%, which is a great place to be going into a major election on this issue.
And just a couple of things related
sure.
to, so, you know, one of them is, what do you have data, or how do you counter the argument that this will make businesses leave California?
Yeah, so that's something that we've heard repeatedly from the opposition, and that this will cause businesses to leave. And I think there's several points. One is that is not, given the research, that's not supported, right? That businesses don't choose locations based on property taxes. And in fact, California will continue to have one of the lowest property tax rates in the nation, even after this measure is passed. And so we know that businesses choose locations for many other reasons, right? And property tax rates are not the reason that they're choosing California. And then the second reason, the second point I want to make on that is, again, who will be impacted. When we look at what the impact will be, it's not an impact that will be felt by all businesses across the state, but it really is a tiny fraction, right? Again, almost 80% of the revenue is coming from only 6%, a small fraction of large commercial industrial properties in the state of California that are valued over 5 million. So it's not going to be an impact felt for all businesses across the state. It's going to have an impact, a big impact on concentrated wealth on some of the largest corporations in the state of California.
And can I just add one other point? I might have said this earlier. You know, every other state in the country reassesses property values on a regular basis. Some places it's every year, some places it's every 3 to 4 years. So that's number one. I mean, if a business moves someplace else, they're just going to get regularly reassessed there. Right. And the second point is this is how we used to do it in California before Prop 13, before 1978. Properties were just regularly reassessed by the county assessor offices. So I think there's a lot of fear in that argument that can be countered by the fact that everybody else is doing it this way except us. So, yeah.
And in particular, the Public Policy Institute of California, PPIC, has done a number of, very rigorous studies showing that business doesn't leave because of property taxes.
Thank you, Jan. Yeah.
So another key part of our strategy is to turn out 1 million voters in 2020. We want to turn out our base voters, which are new voters, infrequent voters, women, immigrants, people of color, probably many of the constituents for many of your organizations, right, for nonprofits. When we look back, we know that about 5 million voters are eligible but not registered to vote. Another 4 million voters are registered but did not vote in 2018. So that's a total of 9 million voters that are eligible or registered but not voting. And so it'll be critical for us to make sure that our base communities, and in this case, many of your constituents are informed about the issue so that they're turning out to vote around critical issues here in the state of California. And so we plan to do a statewide campaign to ensure that voters are informed on the issue. This will require a strategic shift in the electorate. We're currently working with community-based organizations across the state of California. You can see here a map of California of some of the areas where we're currently working through the Million Voters Project. And the goal is to contact 2 million infrequent voters. These are the voters that I mentioned earlier from our base communities. Identify 1.4 million supporters and turn out 1 million voters in November so that we're delivering that margin of victory. And so it'll be critical that we're doing field programs, that we're producing materials in key languages that voters speak in many immigrant communities, so in English and Spanish and in Mandarin, and in a wide variety of languages, and that we have trusted stakeholders out in the communities spreading the message on this measure.
Sure, that's great. And so just to wrap up here, the last factor that we have to consider in how to win, of course, is fundraising, something that every nonprofit knows only too well. So, this, no joke, will be a very uphill fight. We have a large and fierce opposition, as we've mentioned earlier, the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, the California Business Roundtable, BNSF Railroad, a big industrial giant, the Irvine Land Company. All of them are beginning to contribute to their committees to defeat Schools and Communities First. And we know we cannot match them dollar for dollar. They have pledged nuclear war against this initiative and upwards of $100 million that they're going to spend. But we feel like if we can do, $68 million along with the expanded electorate that Veronica mentioned a moment ago, we have a strong chance. So we are looking to major donors, to the labor unions that you saw on the slide, to the tech industry, many of which are newer businesses that actually experience the unfairness of all of this, to public charities, and also just to small donors that we are beginning to accumulate through a strong digital effort.
We need 20 house parties this month, right?
Yeah, right. We're doing that too. So look,
So we're doing house parties across the state
every weekend. Lots
so really exciting work that Michele is leading there.
Yeah, that's true. So just as a summary slide here, this is obviously about closing a long-standing corporate loophole, making the wealthiest pay their fair share of what we need to support our schools, return them to a world-class education for young people, and support communities through local services. And it's really about coming into a time when we invest in us and invest in our future generations, move California from the kind of triage state that we have really been over the last 4 decades to the golden state that we once were. So with that, and I know we're coming up on the end of our time, we want to ask you to help. One thing that all nonprofits can do is endorse schools and communities first. Through your board of directors. We can send you lots of background material to help you make the case. Veronica mentioned we're in the final weeks of our signature gathering drive right now to qualify the measure for November 2020. Unfortunately, you cannot download the petition from the internet. It's a hard paper copy, but we can get it to you. In a moment, you'll see the email to contact, but ask your staff, your board members, and if appropriate, your clients to sign the measure. It will help really everyone across the board. Our staff and our volunteers are available to come and do presentations at your office, similar to this or even shorter. We can do it in 5-10 minutes. And we also invite people to be social, to follow and post and comment on social media and through Twitter. So here's our very last slide. I don't know if our pictures are over the type.
While we leave the slide up, let me ask you a couple of the questions that we still have. Right? So one is, how is the reassessment process going to work? Is there going to be like 1 year where everybody gets reassessed? Will there be increments, that kind of thing?
Really great. In our policy work group, we worked for many years with some of the smartest people in the state to figure this out. And so the measure includes a phase-in period for both the assessor's offices, because we know they can't do all this reevaluation overnight. And it also includes a phase-in period for the taxpayer so that they aren't dinged with the full amount right up front. Those details are left to a committee that will have representation from the Board of Equalization, from the assessor's office, from the business community, from the proponents of the campaign to work out some of those details. But we have recommended a phase-in period of several years and then regular reassessment every 3 years.
Thanks. And then here's another question from Henry. Is there a relationship between Prop 13 and racial inequality?
Oh, do you want to take that?
And racial inequality? Well, I mean, and we actually have some of our allies advancement project that is doing a presentation on this very issue tomorrow for our coalition. And they've actually compiled about 40 years of data that looks at what some of the origins, right, around Prop 13. And so what was happening in California was we were seeing busing happening. We were seeing the population of California becoming more diverse, and almost as a response to that, a conservative response was to cut funding for critical programs, right? Funding in schools and funding for local government services right around the time when California was becoming more diverse. And so we've seen some analysis on that. I think it's more stark when we look at what the impact has been. When you look at the disproportionate impact of underfunding schools in California, where the majority of the students are students of color, then you do see a disproportionate impact on African American students, on Latino students, especially when you look at third grade proficiency tests. African American and Latino students fall behind what we're seeing with Anglo students and Asian students, and also in high school graduation rates. And so I think when we're looking at what the disproportionate impact has been on communities of color because of disinvestment, it's greatly felt not only in our schools, but also in our communities.
Thanks. Now, I do just want to remind everybody that nonprofits can take positions on ballot propositions. You saw in an earlier slide that Cal Nonprofits and many nonprofits have formally endorsed Schools and Communities First. We can also organize people to vote yes on this when it comes onto the ballot. It's called grassroots lobbying, so we will want to keep track of how much money and time we're spending on it, but it's very important for us to engage in this kind of advocacy. That's something I think our communities expect and need us to be doing. So thank you very much, Michele and Veronica. This has really been fun. And I thought I knew a lot about this and I didn't. So thank you.
Great.
Me even more. And I want to thank all the people who really asked some really great questions. And I'm going to go to the website and figure out how to get another petition so I can gather more signatures. And we'll keep you abreast at Cal Nonprofits too. So if you're on our mailing list, you'll be seeing what's going on with this campaign and how the other kinds of things that we're going to be letting you know as a kind of campaign moves forward. So thanks, everybody.